The morning sun streamed through the faded curtains of Lynn's small bedroom, casting golden light on the worn keys of her upright piano. She ran her fingers across them, not pressing down, just feeling the familiar ivory under her fingertips. At 19, Lynn had spent more hours at this second-hand instrument than she had with any person. It wasn't much. The middle C stuck sometimes, and the finish had worn away in patches. But it was hers, rescued from a neighbor's garage sale 5 years ago, when her parents finally gave in to her constant begging. Outside the window of their small rural home, the town was already awake. Pickup trucks rumbled down the main road, and the distant sound of the feed store's bell announced another day in a place where dreams usually stayed small. But not Lynn's dreams. Never Lynn's. Her phone buzzed on top of the piano, an unusual occurrence at this hour. She ignored it at first, determined to finish her morning practice routine. This was her ritual. 2 hours before her shift at the diner, fingers dancing across keys, coaxing music from an instrument that had no business sounding as good as she made it sound. The phone buzzed again, persistent. With a sigh, she picked it up, expecting a text from her boss asking her to come in early. Instead, an email notification lit up the screen from an address she didn't recognize. National Conservatory of Music. Lynn nearly dropped her phone. She had been uploading videos of herself playing for 3 years now. Recordings made on her phone propped against a stack of books. The diner's noise sometimes audible in the background when she had to practice after hours. Her channel had a modest following, mostly other amateur musicians and a few kind strangers who left encouraging comments. She never expected anyone important to notice. Her hands trembled as she opened the email. Dear Lynn Chen, it read, I recently came across your interpretation of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 on your channel. While your technique shows the expected limitations of self-teaching, there is something in your playing that cannot be taught, a raw emotional understanding that has caught my attention. I am conducting a master class at the National Conservatory next week. Consider this an invitation to attend as an observer. Perhaps you might even play for us, though I should warn you the standards are extremely high. Professor Thomas Riley, visiting faculty. Lynn read the email 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each reading. The National Conservatory was the most prestigious music school in the country, 8 hours away by bus in the big city. People practiced their whole lives to get in, studying under renowned teachers from childhood, and here she was with no formal training being invited to sit in a room with those people. Mom, she called out, rushing to the kitchen where her mother was packing lunches. Mom, look at this. Her mother, tired from her night shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide, squinted at the phone screen. Her English was good, but she read slowly, mouthing the words as she went. National Conservatory? She finally said, looking up with confusion. What is this? Lynn explained as her father entered the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage, his fingers perpetually stained with engine oil that never quite washed away. It's the best music school in the country, and a famous professor wants me to come to a master class. Her parents exchanged looks. A silent communication developed over 20 years of marriage and shared struggles. Lynn knew that look. It was the same one they'd exchanged when she'd asked for piano lessons as a child, when she'd begged to attend the performing arts high school in the next town over. It was a look that said, we wish we could, but how? The bus ticket will be expensive, her father said gently, and you would need somewhere to stay. I've been saving, Lynn replied quickly, from my tips at the diner. I have almost $300. And what about work? Her mother asked. Hank already complains when you ask for time off. Lynn's shoulders slumped. The reality of their situation was always there, waiting to clip the wings of any dream that grew too big. Her father put his rough hand on her shoulder. When is this master class? Next Tuesday, Lynn said, the excitement in her voice already fading. He nodded thoughtfully. Tuesday. I can pick up an extra shift on Sunday. That would help? Her mother sighed, but then straightened her back. I can ask Mrs. Park if you can stay with her daughter. She moved to the city last year for college, remember? Lynn felt tears spring to her eyes. This was how it had always been. Her dreams seemingly impossible until her parents found a way to make them merely difficult. Are you sure? She asked. It's a lot of money just to sit and listen to other people play. Her father smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. When I was your age, back home, I wanted to be an engineer, not just a mechanic. But there was no money, no chance. He shrugged. Now I fix cars instead of designing them. It's a good life, but he tapped her forehead gently. Don't let what's in here stay trapped if you have a chance to let it out. That night, after her shift at the diner, Lynn sat at her piano in the dark, playing softly so as not to wake her parents. The thought of playing in front of conservatory students terrified her. They would see through her immediately, spot every flaw in her technique, every gap in her knowledge. She had never even had her posture corrected by a real teacher. And yet, as her fingers found the keys of the Chopin piece that had somehow caught Professor Riley's attention, she felt that familiar sensation, the music flowing not just from her fingers but from somewhere deeper. She played not how she was taught, because nobody had taught her, but how the music felt like it should be played. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Park's daughter agreed to let Lynn stay on her sofa for 2 nights. Lynn picked up extra shifts, serving coffee with a smile even to the customers who never tipped. Her boss grudgingly gave her the time off after she agreed to work the following weekend. Her mother pressed her only good dress, removing a stubborn coffee stain with patient determination. The night before her departure, Lynn couldn't sleep. She lay awake, picturing the grand concert hall, imagining the faces of students who had been groomed for musical greatness since they were children. What was she thinking? She was just a girl from nowhere who taught herself on a beaten-up piano. She slipped out of bed and padded to the living room, where her piano waited in the moonlight. She didn't turn on the light, didn't play a note. She just sat on the bench, running her fingers over the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool smoothness against her skin. "We'll be okay," she whispered to the piano, as if comforting an old friend about to face a difficult journey. The morning of her departure arrived with a pink dawn and a knot in Lynn's stomach. Her mother had prepared her favorite breakfast, congee with century eggs and pork, despite the early hour. "You need strength," she insisted, watching Lynn eat with the same anxious expression she'd worn when sending her off to her first day of school years ago. Lynn's father drove her to the bus station in his old pickup truck, the radio playing softly between them. They didn't talk much. Neither of them knew what to say. This was uncharted territory for their family. At the station, he handed her an envelope. "Just a little extra," he said gruffly, "in case of emergency." Lynn knew exactly what that money was, the amount he'd been setting aside for the repair their refrigerator desperately needed. She tried to refuse, but he closed her fingers around the envelope with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Play for them like you play for yourself," he said, "not for their approval, for your joy." The bus ride was long, the landscape outside the window transforming from the familiar fields and scattered houses of her hometown to suburbs and finally the towering buildings of the city. Lynn had visited once before on a school trip in 10th grade, but still found herself pressing her nose to the window like a child, taking in the enormity of the place. Mrs. Park's daughter, Gia, met her at the bus station. Gia was a business student with little interest in music, but she was kind, helping Lynn navigate the subway system to her small apartment. "It's not much," Gia apologized, showing Lynn the lumpy sofa that would be her bed. "But it's safe and close to the conservatory." That night, Lynn couldn't practice. There was no piano in Gia's apartment, and for the first time in years, she felt the absence of it like a phantom limb. She tried to sleep listening to the unfamiliar city noises, sirens, distant conversations, the hum of a million lives happening all around her. Tomorrow, she would sit among the musical elite, in a building dedicated to an art form she'd only experienced through her secondhand piano and YouTube tutorials. The thought should have terrified her, and part of her was indeed scared. But another part, the part that came alive when her fingers touched the keys, felt something else. It felt like coming home. Morning arrived with a watery gray light filtering through Gia's curtainless windows. Lynn dressed carefully in her one good outfit, dark blue pants and a white blouse that her mother had ironed until it was crisp enough to cut paper. She pulled her long black hair into a neat bun, applied a touch of the lipstick she'd borrowed from Gia, and stood staring at her reflection. "You belong there," she told her nervous reflection in a whisper, not quite believing it herself. "You have something to offer too." With a map of the city clutched in her hand and Professor Riley's email saved on her phone, Lynn stepped out into the bustling streets, ready to walk into a world she had only ever dreamed about from afar. Lynn stood frozen at the entrance of the National Conservatory, her heart beating wildly in her chest. The building rose before her like something from another world, all polished stone and gleaming glass with massive columns framing the entrance. Through the wide windows she could see people moving with purpose, carrying instrument cases and stacks of sheet music, all of them looking like they belonged there. She checked Professor Riley's email one more time, confirming the room number, then took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy doors. The lobby was even more impressive inside, a vast space with a domed ceiling painted with scenes of classical composers. The floor was marble, and Lynn's worn shoes squeaked slightly as she walked, making her wince at each step. A security guard at a desk looked up at her with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his eyes taking in her simple outfit. "I'm here for Professor Riley's masterclass," Lynn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Room 305? The guard nodded and pointed toward a sweeping staircase. "Third floor, east wing." Lynn thanked him and headed for the stairs, clutching her small backpack that contained her sheet music and a bottle of water. As she climbed, she passed students who seemed to radiate confidence. A young man carried a violin case with the ease of someone who had been doing it all his life. Two girls walked by in matching black dresses, discussing something about chromatic scales with animated gestures. By the time Lynn reached the third floor, her mouth was dry. She followed the signs to room 305, a large rehearsal hall with its door slightly ajar. Inside, she could hear the murmur of voices and occasionally a burst of laughter. Lynn paused outside, gathering her courage. Through the gap in the door, she could see about 20 students seated in a semicircle around a magnificent grand piano. Unlike the upright she practiced on at home, this instrument gleamed under the lights, its lid raised like a black wing. A tall man with silver hair stood by the piano, gesturing as he spoke. His posture was perfect, his movements precise. Professor Riley, she guessed. The students watched him with rapt attention, nodding at his words. Lynn took one more deep breath and pushed the door open. The conversation halted immediately. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and the silence in the room became heavy. "Sorry I'm late," Lynn said, her voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm Lynn Chen. Professor Riley invited me." The silver-haired man looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Ah, the YouTube pianist," he said, and Lynn couldn't tell if there was amusement or disdain in his voice. "Please join us. We were just discussing the program for today." Lynn slipped into the room, acutely aware of the stairs following her. The only empty seat was in the back row, and she made her way there, trying not to draw more attention to herself. As she sat down, she noticed the students around her were dressed almost uniformly in blacks and grays, many wearing clothes that looked expensive even in their simplicity. Her white blouse and blue pants suddenly felt childish and out of place. "As I was saying," Professor Riley continued, "today we'll be focusing on interpretation versus technical perfection. Each of you will perform your prepared piece and we'll discuss the balance between expressing emotion and maintaining technical accuracy." A young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair raised her hand. "Will we be evaluated on both aspects equally?" "That depends on the piece," Riley answered. "Some compositions demand technical precision above all, while others allow for more interpretive freedom. That's what makes music interesting, don't you think?" There were murmurs of agreement around the room. Lynn remained silent, taking in everything. "Now let's begin with introductions," Riley said. "Please tell us your name, your primary instrument, and your musical background." "Let's start with you." He pointed to a young man in the front row. One by one, the students introduced themselves. Lynn listened with growing dismay as each one listed impressive credentials. "Anton Petrov, piano. I've been studying since I was 4 and attended the Salzburg Summer Academy for the past 3 years. Mei Wang, violin. I'm a third-year student here and recently performed with the National Symphony as a featured soloist. David Lee, piano. I've won the Regional Young Artist Competition twice and studied with Maestro Gershwin last summer." As the introductions moved toward the back row, Lynn felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. What would she say? That she learned by watching YouTube tutorials? That she practiced in a diner after closing time when the owner took pity on her? Finally, it was her turn. The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to her. "I'm Lin Chen," she began, her voice small. "I play piano." Professor Riley nodded encouragingly. "And your background?" Lin swallowed hard. "I'm self-taught. I don't have formal training. I started playing on a keyboard my parents got from a garage sale when I was 10, and then we got an old upright piano a few years ago. I work at a diner in my hometown and I practice there sometimes after closing." The silence that followed was different from before. Lin saw several students exchange glances. A few smirked behind their hands. From the front row she heard someone whisper, "Is this a joke?" Professor Riley's expression remained neutral. "Interesting," he said finally. "And what piece have you prepared for today?" Lin hesitated. She had practiced Chopin's Ballad No. 1, the piece that had caught Riley's attention online. But hearing the credentials of the other students, she suddenly felt it was presumptuous to attempt such a complex piece. I'm not sure if I should play today," she stammered. "Maybe I should just observe." A tall young man with dark hair turned in his seat to look at her directly. His eyes were cold with amusement. "Come now," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "We're all curious to hear what self-teaching produces. It's a rare opportunity for us." Several students laughed outright at this. Lin felt her face burn with embarrassment. Professor Riley held up a hand. "That's enough, Victor," he said mildly, though he didn't seem particularly bothered by the comment. "Miss Chen is here at my invitation." He turned back to Lin. "Perhaps later when you're more comfortable. Let's begin with our scheduled performances. Victor Leonov will start us off." The dark-haired young man who had mocked Lin stood and approached the piano with easy confidence. He sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and then placed his hands on the keys. Without sheet music, he launched into Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire. Lin watched, both intimidated and mesmerized as Victor's fingers flew across the keyboard. His technique was flawless, each note perfectly articulated, every run executed with precision. The other students watched with appreciation, some nodding along with the familiar melody. When he finished, the room burst into applause. Victor accepted it with a small nod, as if it were merely his due. "Excellent technical execution," Professor Riley commented, though perhaps a bit mechanical in the freer sections. Remember, Liszt was a showman as well as a composer. He wrote to impress, yes, but also to move his audience emotionally. Victor nodded seriously. "I'll work on that balance." As the next student took her place at the piano, Lin tried to make herself smaller in her seat. Throughout the morning, one performer followed another, each displaying years of training and remarkable skill. Some received gentle criticism, others lavish praise, but all were clearly accomplished musicians. During a short break, Lin slipped out to find a bathroom. As she washed her hands, two girls from the class entered, deep in conversation. They fell silent when they saw Lin, then continued speaking as if she weren't there. "Did you see her shoes?" one whispered, not quietly enough. "And she doesn't even have proper sheet music, just printouts." "I don't understand why Professor Riley invited her," the other replied. "Maybe he felt sorry for her?" Lin dried her hands quickly and left without looking at them. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, fighting back tears. What was she doing here? This had been a mistake. She should leave now, catch an early bus home, and forget this ridiculous dream. She was about to collect her backpack when she heard piano music floating from the rehearsal room, someone practicing during the break. The piece was familiar, one she had taught herself last year. But something about the performance bothered her. The notes were all correct, the tempo perfect, but it sounded empty, like reading words without understanding their meaning. Lin moved closer to the door and peeked inside. A young woman was at the piano, her posture rigid as she played through a section of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Professor Riley stood nearby, checking his phone with a bored expression. Without thinking, Lin stepped inside and listened more closely. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata was one of her favorite pieces to play late at night at the diner, when the lights were dim and the room empty, except for her. The slow, haunting melody had always spoken to her of loneliness and longing, feelings she knew well. "Technically correct," Professor Riley said when the student finished. "But where is the emotion? This piece is a lamentation, a confession of unrequited love. I should feel something when you play it." The student nodded stiffly. I'll try again. Don't try, Riley sighed. Feel. Music isn't just notes on a page. Lynn backed away from the door, a strange feeling growing inside her. For the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of confidence. Technical perfection was something she couldn't compete with. She hadn't had the years of training these students had received. But feeling the music? That was something else entirely. As students began filtering back into the room, Lynn returned to her seat with a new resolve. She would stay, at least for now. She would listen and learn what she could. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the courage to play after all. After the break, the masterclass continued with more performances. Lynn sat quietly in the back row, absorbing everything she could. Though she still felt out of place, she had decided to stay, at least for now. There was so much to learn here, even if all she did was listen. Professor Riley moved around the room as each student played, offering critiques that were sometimes gentle, sometimes cutting. He clearly knew his craft, pointing out subtleties in the music that Lynn had never considered before. The tempo marking isn't just a suggestion, he told one student, a serious-looking boy who had rushed through a Bach prelude. It's the composer speaking to you across centuries. Listen to what he's telling you, to another who played with technical brilliance but rigid posture. Music lives in the body before it reaches the fingers. If you're stiff as a board, how can you expect the notes to dance? Lynn found herself nodding along with these insights, mentally applying them to her own playing. She'd never had anyone explain these concepts to her before. Everything she knew came from watching videos online, reading books from the local library, and countless hours of trial and error. The afternoon wore on. Outside the tall windows, the sun began to slant, casting golden rectangles across the polished floor. Lynn had almost begun to relax, thinking she might get through the day without having to play, when Professor Riley suddenly turned to face the room. We've heard from most of our regular students, he said, scanning the circle of faces, but I believe we have a guest who hasn't performed yet. All eyes shifted to Lynn. She felt her heart drop to her stomach. Ms. Chen, Riley continued, would you honor us with a performance? The room went completely silent. Lynn gripped the edges of her chair, her palms suddenly damp. She began, her voice barely audible. I don't think I'm at the same level as everyone else here. Victor Leonov, the tall student who had mocked her earlier, let out a soft laugh. Surely that's obvious by now, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Professor, why waste our time? We're here to learn from excellence, not amateur hour. Several students nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Lynn felt her face burn with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to somehow become invisible in her chair, or better yet, to go back in time and never come to this place where she so clearly didn't belong. Professor Riley didn't immediately respond to Victor's comment. Instead, he looked thoughtfully at Lynn. I invited Miss Chen because I saw something in her playing that interested me, he said finally. Technical skill can be taught. Other qualities cannot, Victor's expression soured. With all due respect, Professor, anyone can post videos online these days. Hit the right notes in the right order, add some dramatic facial expressions for the camera, and suddenly you're a sensation. He turned to Lynn with a cold smile. No offense intended, of course. Lynn looked down at her hands. The same hands that had played for hours in her small bedroom, that had wiped down tables at the diner, that had turned pages of instructional books borrowed from the library. They weren't the hands of a classically trained pianist. They were working hands with short nails and a small burn scar from the diner's coffee machine. I understand, she said quietly. I shouldn't have come here. She began to gather her things, preparing to leave when Professor Riley spoke again. Actually, he said, his tone harder now, I think this is an excellent teaching moment. He walked to the center of the room. Music isn't just about training and technique. It's about understanding, feeling, connecting with something beyond the notes on the page. He turned to Victor. You played Liszt beautifully earlier. Every note was perfect, but did you move anyone in this room? Before Victor could answer, Riley continued. Ms. Chen may not have your years of training, but in the videos I watched, she played with something many trained musicians lack. Genuine emotion. Victor's jaw tightened. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "So," Riley said, clapping his hands together, "I propose a demonstration, Mr. Leonov. Since you seem so certain about Ms. Chen's abilities, why don't you challenge her? Choose a piece, something substantial, and let's see how our different approaches to music compare." Lynn froze halfway out of her chair. Was this really happening? She couldn't possibly play after Victor, not in front of all these people who already looked down on her. It would be humiliating. Victor, however, seemed delighted by the suggestion. His eyes lit up with a competitive gleam. "Gladly," he said, and turned to Lynn. "Do you know Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3? A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Rachmaninoff's Third was notoriously difficult, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the repertoire. Professional pianists spent months preparing it. There was no way a self-taught player from a small town could handle it. Lynn knew the piece, of course. She had listened to recordings of it countless times, in awe of its complexity and power. She had even attempted parts of it just for fun, never imagining she would play it for anyone else. "That's hardly fair," one of the students spoke up unexpectedly. It was the serious boy who had played Bach earlier. "Choose something more reasonable." "Why?" Victor countered. "If she's worthy of being here, she should be able to handle it. Unless Professor Riley's faith in her is misplaced." Riley considered for a moment, then looked at Lynn. "The choice is yours. Miss Chen, you can decline, of course." Lynn stood frozen, every instinct telling her to run, to get out of this room, this building, this city, and never look back. These people weren't like her. They lived in a different world with different rules and expectations, and yet something kept her rooted to the spot. Maybe it was pride or stubbornness or the thought of returning home having accomplished nothing. Or maybe it was the memory of her father's words, "Don't let what's in here stay trapped if you have a chance to let it out." "I know parts of it," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Not the entire piece," Victor smirked. "The first movement should be sufficient. Surely you can manage that much." Professor Riley frowned at Victor's tone but nodded to Lynn. "The first movement, then. And don't worry about playing it from memory, we have the sheet music." "I don't read music very well," Lynn admitted, bracing herself for more mockery. "I learn by ear and by watching." This admission caused another stir among the students. One girl whispered to her neighbor loud enough for Lynn to hear, "How can she call herself a pianist?" Riley silenced the murmurs with a raised hand. "That's even more interesting," he said. "So you've learned Rachmaninoff by ear?" Lynn nodded, feeling her cheeks flush again. "Not the whole concerto, just pieces of it, the parts I love most." Victor laughed outright. "This gets better and better," he said. "Very well. Play what you can, however you can." Lynn took a deep breath and walked slowly to the grand piano. It was much larger than her upright at home, its surface reflecting the afternoon light like still water. She sat on the bench, adjusting its height, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her back. The sheet music for Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto was placed on the stand in front of her, pages dense with notes that blurred before her eyes. She gently pushed it aside. Those symbols meant little to her. Her music lived in her ears and her heart, not on paper. "Whenever you're ready," Professor Riley said kindly. Lynn placed her hands on the keys, surprised by how cool and smooth they felt under her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, to find that quiet place inside where the music lived. The room around her faded. She forgot about Victor's challenge, about the judging eyes of the conservatory students, about Professor Riley's expectations. Instead, she thought about her small bedroom at home, about her parents who worked so hard to give her this chance, about the worn keys of her second-hand piano that knew her touch so well. And then, without further hesitation, she began to play. The famous opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Third filled the room, gentle at first, questioning, like the beginning of a story. Lynn played them not as written on the discarded sheet music, but as she had heard them in her head 100 times, as they had lived in her imagination during long nights at the diner, when she would close her eyes and picture herself playing in a grand concert hall. As the introduction gave way to the main theme, her fingers found their path across the keys with growing confidence. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about the music itself, about giving voice to something that had no words. She heard a few gasps from behind her as she navigated the first difficult passage. Not perfectly, not with Victor's technical precision, but with a fluidity that came from playing for joy rather than judgment. Where her technique fell short, her expression filled the gaps, making the piano sing in a way that felt almost human. The music built in intensity, the famous melody soaring above the complex harmonies beneath. Lynn swayed slightly on the bench, her body moving naturally with the phrases, letting the music flow through her rather than forcing it out. She forgot about the parts she didn't know well and simply followed where the music led her, improvising connections between the sections she had memorized. Her playing wasn't note perfect, but it had life. It breathed and pulsed and yearned. As she approached the cadenza, the most technically demanding part of the first movement, Lynn felt a moment of panic. This was where she would surely fail. Her fingers weren't trained for this level of complexity, but it was too late to stop now. She took a breath and plunged forward, letting muscle memory and instinct guide her. Notes tumbled from under her fingers like water over stones, not always in the right order, not always with the right timing, but always with the right feeling. Where she simplified, she did so with musicality, keeping the essence of Rachmaninoff's intention even when she couldn't execute his exact notes. Behind her, the room had gone completely still. No one whispered, no one shifted in their seats. Even Victor, who had been so certain of her failure, watched with an expression that had moved from smugness to confusion to something approaching disbelief. And still Lynn played on, lost in the world Rachmaninoff had created, adding her own voice to his across the century that separated them. This wasn't about being perfect. This was about being heard. Time seemed to stretch and bend as Lynn played. The grand piano responded to her touch in ways her old upright at home never could, offering new colors and textures she hadn't known were possible. Each note rang clear and true in the perfect acoustics of the rehearsal hall. Lynn had passed the halfway point of the first movement now. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands remained steady, finding their way through the complex passages with an instinct that surprised even her. Where she couldn't match Rachmaninoff's technical demands, she found creative solutions, simplifying some runs but preserving their character, emphasizing melody lines where the accompaniment was too complex for her untrained fingers. Behind her, the atmosphere in the room had transformed. The earlier whispers and snickers had given way to stunned silence. Even Victor, who had issued the challenge with such confidence in her failure, sat with his arms crossed, his expression caught between disbelief and reluctant admiration. Professor Riley stood near the piano, his notepad forgotten in his hand. He watched Lynn with intense focus, taking in not just her playing but the way she connected with the instrument, the natural sway of her body, the slight smile that appeared when she navigated a difficult passage successfully, the complete absorption in what she was doing. As the movement built toward its climax, Lynn felt a strange sense of freedom. Yes, she was missing notes. Yes, her technique couldn't match that of the conservatory students who had been training for years. But in this moment, none of that mattered. She was speaking through the piano in a language that needed no translation. The final section approached, a return to the haunting main theme before the orchestra would typically join for the grand finale. Lynn slowed slightly, savoring these last moments at the magnificent instrument. Her fingers caressed rather than struck the keys, drawing out a tenderness in the music that made it feel like a whispered confession. Then, with a final ripple of notes that cascaded like falling stars, she finished the movement, letting the last chord hang in the air until it faded to nothing. For 3 heartbeats, the room remained absolutely silent. Lynn sat motionless at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes closed. She was afraid to turn around, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Part of her wanted to stay in this moment forever, suspended between performance and judgment. Then came the sound of a single person clapping. Lynn opened her eyes and turned to see the serious boy who had played Bach earlier. He had risen from his seat and was applauding with a genuine smile on his face. Another student joined in, then another. Soon, most of the room was on their feet, their applause filling the space that moments ago had held only music. There were exceptions. Victor remained seated, as did a few others who seemed unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed. Professor Riley was clapping too, nodding with a satisfied expression. When the applause began to die down, he raised his hand for quiet. "Thank you, Miss Chen," he said, his voice warm with approval. "That was Illuminating. Lynn felt a blush creep up her neck. I messed up a lot of notes, she admitted. The cadenza especially. Notes, Riley interrupted, are only part of music. Anyone can play notes. He glanced meaningfully at Victor. What you just demonstrated goes beyond technical accuracy. You showed us what Rachmaninoff was trying to say. The blonde girl who had spoken earlier raised her hand. But she didn't play what was written, she pointed out. She changed parts of it. Yes, Riley agreed. And do you know what we call it when a performer makes such changes with musical understanding and purpose? Interpretation. It's what separates artists from technicians. He walked to the center of the room. This is precisely why I invited Ms. Chen to join us today. I wanted you all to see that while technical perfection is something to strive for, it means nothing without heart. Victor finally spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. Are you saying technique doesn't matter? That we've wasted years of our lives perfecting our skills? Not at all, Riley replied calmly. Technique is essential. It gives you the tools to express what you want to express. But it's not the end goal, it's the means to an end. He turned to address the whole room. Many of you play perfectly. Your fingers do exactly what you tell them to do. But what are you telling them? What are you trying to say through the music? That's the question you need to ask yourselves. The serious boy who had been the first to applaud looked at Lynn with new respect. How do you do it? He asked. How do you make it sound so alive? Lynn hesitated, not sure how to answer. How could she explain something that had always felt as natural to her as breathing? Listen, she said finally. Not just with my ears, but with everything inside me. I try to feel what the composer was feeling, what they were trying to tell us. But without proper training, how can you know what the composer intended? Asked another student. Lynn shrugged. I don't know for sure. Nobody does, I guess. But music is a language, right? Even if you don't know all the grammar rules, you can still understand what someone is trying to say if you listen carefully enough. Professor Riley nodded approvingly. Well put. Music exists beyond the page. Rachmaninoff didn't just write notes, he wrote emotions, stories, pieces of his soul. Our job as performers is to bring those to life, not just reproduce them mechanically. He walked over to Lynn and gestured for her to stand. Thank you for reminding us of that today. Lynn rose from the piano bench, her legs slightly shaky. The tension that had built up during her performance was releasing now, leaving her feeling drained but strangely light, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Students began to gather around her, their earlier coldness replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, genuine warmth. Where did you learn to play like that? Asked a girl with a short dark bob. Did you really teach yourself? Another wanted to know. How did you memorize such a difficult piece without reading music? Lynn answered their questions as best she could, still overwhelmed by the sudden change in their attitude toward her. Only Victor remained apart, watching the scene with narrowed eyes from his seat across the room. Professor Riley let the conversations flow for a few minutes, then checked his watch. We'll need to wrap up soon, he announced. But before we do, I'd like to hear one more performance. He looked directly at Victor. Mr. Leonov, would you play something for us again? Something with feeling this time. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly and walked to the piano. Lynn returned to her seat, curious to see how he would respond to the challenge. Without announcing his selection, Victor began to play Chopin's Ballet No. 1, the very piece that had caught Professor Riley's attention in Lynn's YouTube videos. The choice felt deliberate, almost confrontational. His playing was, as before, technically immaculate. Every note was precisely where it should be, every dynamic marking observed to the letter. But there was something different now, a new tension in his shoulders, a slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated not just on accuracy but on expression. Lynn watched his hands moving across the keyboard with precision and grace. Where her playing was intuitive and raw, his was polished and controlled. But for the first time, she could sense him reaching for something beyond perfection, something more personal and honest. When he finished, the room applauded again, though with less enthusiasm than they had shown for Lynn. Victor acknowledged it with a nod, his face unreadable. Professor Riley thanked him, then addressed the whole group. This concludes our master class for today. I hope you'll all reflect on what we've experienced. Technical skill and emotional understanding are not opposing forces. At their best, they complement and enhance each other. Your homework is to find that balance in your own playing. As students began gathering their things, Riley approached Lynn. "A word, Miss Chen?" Lynn nodded, her stomach tightening with anxiety again. Had she embarrassed herself after all? Was he going to gently suggest that she stick to playing in diners? But Riley's expression was kind. "That was quite remarkable," he said. "Rough around the edges, certainly, but remarkable nonetheless. Have you ever considered formal training?" Lynn gave a small laugh. "Every day. But it's not really an option for me." "Because of financial constraints?" She nodded. "My parents work hard just to keep our house and put food on the table. Piano lessons were never in the budget, let alone something like—" She gestured around the ornate rehearsal hall. Riley seemed to consider this. "There are scholarships, you know, for students with exceptional talent." Lynn's heart skipped a beat. "Scholarships?" "Yes, they're competitive, of course, and they would require you to pass certain technical exams. Your reading would need work, and your technique would require significant refinement." He smiled at her shocked expression. "But the raw material is there. I'd be willing to help you prepare if you're interested." Lynn felt dizzy, as if the floor had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. "You'd help me?" "I recognize potential when I see it," Riley said simply. "It would be a shame to let it go to waste." From across the room, Victor watched this exchange, his eyes cold. The serious boy approached him, saying something Lynn couldn't hear. Victor shook his head sharply and turned away, gathering his belongings with quick, angry movements. Lynn barely noticed. Her mind was racing, trying to process what Riley was suggesting. A scholarship, formal training, a chance to learn properly, to develop her skills beyond what she could teach herself in her bedroom or at the diner after hours. "It would be hard work," Riley cautioned. "Harder than anything you've done before. And there's no guarantee you'd receive the scholarship." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Lynn said, thinking of her parents who had always led by example in that regard. "And I'd rather try and fail than wonder what might have been." Riley nodded, seeming pleased with her answer. "Good. Then let's talk details." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Call my office tomorrow. We'll set up a proper assessment and develop a plan." Lynn took the card carefully, as if it might disappear if she held it too tightly. On heavy cream-colored stock, it simply read, "Professor Thomas Riley, piano performance," and listed a phone number. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You've said plenty today," Riley replied, nodding toward the piano. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen without words." As the room emptied, Lynn remained standing there, holding the small card that somehow contained the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. Whatever happened next, she knew that today had changed something fundamental. She had been heard. She had been seen. And for now, that was enough. The bus ride back to Gia's apartment felt surreal. Lynn sat by the window, watching the city lights blur as evening fell, Professor Riley's business card safely tucked in her pocket. Every few minutes, she would touch it through the fabric of her pants, making sure it was still there, that this day had actually happened. Gia was waiting for her when she returned, curious about how the masterclass had gone. Lynn tried to explain but found herself laughing and crying at the same time, the emotions of the day finally catching up with her. "You should have seen their faces," she told Gia, wiping her eyes. "They thought I was a joke, and then you showed them," Gia finished for her, smiling. "I wish I could have been there." That night, Lynn called her parents from Gia's apartment. She tried to keep her voice calm as she told them what had happened, but excitement kept breaking through. "Professor Riley says there's a scholarship I could apply for," she explained. "He wants to help me prepare." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then her father's voice, thick with emotion. "I knew it. I always knew you had something special in you." Her mother spoke up, practical as always. "A scholarship? For the whole tuition?" "I'm not sure yet," Lynn admitted. "I'll find out more details tomorrow when I call his office. But even if it's partial, I could work to cover the rest." "We'll find a way," her father said firmly. "If this is your chance, we'll find a way." Lynn slept little that night, her mind too full of possibilities. The next morning, she called Professor Riley's office and spoke with his assistant, who scheduled an assessment for that afternoon. Lynn spent the hours in between pacing Gia's small apartment, alternating between excitement and terror. What if yesterday had been a fluke? What if, in the cold light of day, Professor Riley realized she wasn't worth his time? By the time she arrived at Riley's private studio near the conservatory, her stomach was in knots. The studio was smaller than the rehearsal hall, but no less intimidating. Shelves lined with music books, walls decorated with framed programs from concerts around the world, and in the center, another beautiful grand piano. Professor Riley greeted her warmly. Ms. Chen, right on time. The assessment was thorough. Riley had her play scales and arpeggios, checking her finger positions and hand movements. He tested her ear by playing chords and asking her to identify them. He had her sight-read simple pieces, nodding at her struggles but not commenting. Then he asked her to play something she knew well. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but whatever she felt most comfortable with. Lynn chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she had taught herself years ago, and played so often it lived in her muscles as much as her memory. As she played, Riley walked around the piano, observing her from different angles, occasionally making notes on a pad. When she finished, he sat across from her, his expression serious. "You have remarkable natural talent," he began. "Your ear is exceptional and your musical instincts are strong." Lynn waited for the but she was sure would follow. However, Riley continued, "There are significant gaps in your training that would need to be addressed. Your technique, while functional, has developed some unconventional habits. Your reading skills are rudimentary at best, and your theoretical knowledge is virtually non-existent." Lynn nodded, her hope fading with each word. "The scholarship committee would expect a certain level of proficiency in all these areas," he said. "As you are now, I don't believe you would qualify." Lynn's heart sank. She had known it was too good to be true. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for your time anyway." "I haven't finished," Riley said, holding up a hand. "While you wouldn't qualify now, with intensive preparation, you might be ready by next year's auditions." Lynn looked up, confused. "Next year?" Riley nodded. "I'm proposing a mentorship. I would work with you once a week for the next 9 months to prepare you for the scholarship audition. We would focus on correcting your technique, developing your reading skills, and filling in the theoretical gaps." "But," Lynn hesitated, "I live 8 hours away, and I couldn't afford regular lessons, especially with someone like you." "I'm aware of the logistics," Riley replied. "That's why I've spoken with Dean Wu this morning. The conservatory occasionally offers outreach programs to talented students from underserved areas. We could arrange for your lessons to be covered under that initiative." Lynn stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Why would you do this for me?" Riley's expression softened. "Because yesterday you reminded me of something important, something I fear I had begun to forget after decades of teaching. You reminded me that music isn't just about technical perfection. It's about communication, about touching people's hearts." He stood up and walked to a shelf, pulling down a framed photograph. "This was me," he said, showing her the image of a young boy at a piano much too big for him. "I grew up in a coal mining town. No one in my family had ever touched a piano until the school got a donation of an old upright. My teacher saw something in me and fought to get me lessons, scholarships, opportunities I never would have had otherwise." He put the photograph back carefully. "Sometimes the most extraordinary talents come from the most ordinary places. All they need is a chance." Lynn felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll work harder than you've ever worked before," Riley replied. "Because that's what this will take." And work she did. The months that followed were the most challenging of Lynn's life. She returned home with a practice regimen from Riley, books on music theory and beginning sight-reading exercises. Every week she recorded her progress and sent the videos to him. Once a month her parents scraped together enough money for bus fare so she could travel to the city for an in-person lesson. During the week, she continued working at the diner, picking up extra shifts to contribute to these travel costs. After closing, the owner let her practice on the small electric keyboard he'd bought specifically for her use. "Can't have my star employee running off to the big city without being prepared," he'd joked, though Lynn had seen the pride in his eyes. Her hands developed calluses, then blisters, then calluses again. Her brain ached from memorizing circle of fifths and key signatures. Sometimes late at night she would cry from frustration when a particular technique adjustment wouldn't stick, or a theory concept refused to make sense. But slowly, steadily, she improved. Her technique became more refined. Her reading skills progressed from painfully slow to moderately functional. Her understanding of music theory began to inform her playing in ways she hadn't expected, adding new dimensions to pieces she thought she knew well. Through it all, she kept in touch with Gia, who became a close friend and her biggest cheerleader in the city. Occasionally, Gia would mention Victor Leonov. Apparently, he had won another competition or given a well-reviewed recital. Lynn tried not to think about him too much, focusing instead on her own journey. 9 months passed this way in a blur of practice, work, and monthly bus rides. When the day of the scholarship audition finally arrived, Lynn felt both more prepared and more terrified than she had ever been in her life. The audition committee consisted of 5 professors, including Riley, who gave her an encouraging nod as she entered the room. She performed her prepared pieces, Bach, Chopin, and yes, a section of Rachmaninoff's Third, along with scales, sight reading, and a brief theory examination. When it was over, they told her they would deliberate and inform applicants within 2 weeks. Lynn thanked them, her legs shaking as she left the room. The next 14 days were the longest of her life. She threw herself into work at the diner, trying not to check her email every 5 minutes. Her parents tried to distract her with movies and home-cooked meals, but nothing could ease the gnawing anxiety. Then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while she was refilling salt shakers at the diner, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She nearly dropped the salt canister as she read the subject line, Conservatory Scholarship Committee Decision. With trembling fingers, she opened the email. Dear Ms. Chen, we are pleased to inform you that you have been awarded the Henderson Full Merit Scholarship for the upcoming academic year. She read no further before, letting out a cry that startled the few customers in the diner. Her boss came running from the kitchen thinking she'd hurt herself. When she showed him the email, he hugged her so hard he lifted her off the ground, then announced free coffee for everyone to celebrate. That evening, when her parents came home from work, she was waiting on the porch with the printed email. Her mother read it, then read it again as if the words might change. Her father simply pulled Lynn into a hug, his shoulders shaking with silent tears. 3 months later, Lynn moved into the conservatory dormitories. Her roommate was a violinist from Seattle who didn't seem to care that Lynn came from a small town or had taught herself to play. On her first day of classes, she ran into the serious boy who had been the first to applaud her performance a year ago. His name was Thomas, and he remembered her immediately. "You're the Rachmaninoff girl," he said with a smile. "I knew you'd be back." In Theory 101, she found herself seated alphabetically next to none other than Victor Leonov. He acknowledged her with a curt nod, his expression unreadable. Lynn nodded back, feeling neither intimidation nor resentment. They were simply 2 students now, each with their own path. At the end of her first semester, the conservatory held its traditional winter showcase. Students from all departments performed for family, friends, and faculty. Lynn's parents made the long journey to see her play, sitting in the front row in their best clothes, their faces shining with pride. As Lynn waited backstage for her turn, Professor Riley stopped by. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but not like before." "This feels right," Riley smiled. "You belong here, Lynn. Never forget that." When they called her name, Lynn walked onto the stage of the Grand Concert Hall, the same building she had entered with such trepidation a year before. The magnificent Steinway piano gleamed under the stage lights. The audience was a blur of faces, but she could make out her parents in the front row, and Gia a few seats away. She sat at the bench, adjusted it to her height, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she thought of her old upright piano at home, with its sticky middle C and worn finish. It had been her first teacher, her first friend in the world of music. Then she began to play. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but her own composition, something she had written during her months of preparation. It told the story of a girl from a small town who dared to dream bigger than her circumstances, who faced mockery and doubt but found her voice anyway. As the final notes faded, the hall erupted in applause. Lynn stood and bowed, her heart full. She had proven herself not just to Victor, not just to the conservatory, but to herself. And in the end, that was the victory that mattered most.